Crow laws will be the first thing I'd talk about. It was a series of laws which went across a lot of states, not just Southern, but the worst examples were in the South. And it meant that people had to be separate. White and black people had to be separate. It was illegal for black and white people to marry, for example. Hospitals, cinemas, shops, hotels, parks, libraries, theatres, all segregated. But the worst situation was that schools were segregated to an extent that black children got a worse education than white children. So this helps to explain why they were so badly discriminated against, because they came out of school generally with a worse education than white children, because they were given the worst conditions in schools, and therefore this made it easier for white people to justify the discrimination against black people because they weren't as educated, which was of course the fault of the situation that they were in. But the Jim Crow laws also emphasised this idea that was popular among white racists, that black people were inferior because they were separating them, and they were always getting the worst deal, as we know. So the Jim Crow laws will be my first. The other reason why black people were treated as inferior was because of the deep-rooted racism due to Southern history. By that I mean the Civil War was largely fought over slavery, and slavery had been in existence largely in the South. So people in the South, it was sort of, although people weren't around at this time who'd experienced slavery or the Civil War, that history was still there. There was still the bitterness. Okay, it was echoes down through history, but there was still a generation's worth of bitterness that black people had cost the Southern people a lot because of the Civil War, which was ridiculous, of course, because the black people didn't ask for slavery. But there was long-standing, deep-rooted racism in the South that had grown through slavery, when black people were treated as slaves, and then after the Civil War, when black people were blamed or discriminated. They were the victims of massive racism after the Civil War as well. Not only this, but black people were not allowed to exercise their right to vote because the states had got around the problem of being not allowed to ban due to colour of skin by doing things like introducing literacy tests and then giving ridiculously hard literacy tests to black people, or making a poll tax being one of the reasons. Like if you paid a particular poll tax, then you had the right to vote. Well, of course, black people were usually doing the lower skilled, lower paid jobs, because of the whole education thing that we've already spoken about. So because they weren't voting, they weren't so important to politicians, hence why they were, because they didn't have to listen to them to get voted into power, so hence why they were treated as inferior. You've got to say Brown v TOPEKA is the main reason why there was progress in education. Little girl takes, well, the lawyers of the NAACP took on the area of Topeka, the Board of Education of Topeka, to say that it was wrong to have segregation in schools, and this little girl was having to travel far further in a dangerous route to get to the black school when there was a perfectly good white school nearby. Anyway, whatever the case, you don't need to really write about in your exam. The significance of it, though, you do. And the significance of it was that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court ruled that there was no place for separate education in America. And he said that now all schools should be integrated. And some areas began to desegregate, so that by 1957, more than 300,000 black children were attending schools that had formerly been segregated. This is a big reason why there was massive progress in education, although it should be noted there were 2.4 million black Southern children who were still being educated in segregated schools at this point. But it was the start of change there. It was an important first step for schools to end up desegregated later on. Absolutely crucial, Brown versus Topeka. Well, coming out of Brown versus Topeka was Little Rock High, because 9 black children enrolled there, and the state governor in Arkansas, spelled Arkansas, but Arkansas is how you say it, tried to stop them from coming in, got the National Guard to stop those kids from attending school. This was significant because the president ended up stepping in to stop this from happening, took control of the Civil Guard, It's President Eisenhower, by the way, and sent in the national troops as well, so that for the rest of the year, the troops protected the black children, made sure they could go to school. Well, despite the president's intervention, the governor closed all Arkansas schools the following year. So closed all the schools. He had the power to do that. So it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. And many white and most black students had no school for a year, just to stop these 9 black children going to a white school. But again, the Supreme Court stepped in and forced Arkansas to open their schools again. So significant, because it's showing the president and the army is on the side of black people, especially in the case of education. And just generally, the success of the civil rights movement was increasing sympathy for black people. So the horrific murder of Emmett Till, which we'll talk about later, and the Montgomery bus boycott, all these things were showing that the white racists in the South were acting unreasonably and increasing the support for the civil rights movement, which included education, especially because people tend to be more sympathetic about children's issues. Young lad goes into a shop in the South. This lad was from the North, visiting the South, went in, flirted with the white shop lady, and her husband and cousin or something, anyway, 2 of her relatives beat him to death. The shock and the horror of this incident, I mean, it happens every lesson, every time I teach it, the students go, what? Especially when I show you the pictures. But it created huge publicity and masses of sympathy from both white and black people to the plight of African Americans in the South. And obviously, the fact that it shocked white people into supporting the civil rights movement was important, because it was white people who were in government who could actually do something about it. It was also significant and created more publicity was the fact that the jury in the case was all white in Mississippi, a very, very racist state. And they decided that the reason why the 2 men who were identified as having done the killing were quite clearly guilty, they got away with it because the jury said that the government had failed to prove that the body was that of Emmett Till's, even though it blatantly was. It was on some sort of technicality. And it could only happen in the racist state of Mississippi and any other racist southern state like that. So again, massive shock, horror, massive sympathy for the civil rights movement and for the plight of black people in the South, amongst northerners and, significantly, white people. And finally, there was the fact that Till's body, with his grotesquely misshapen face because of how badly he'd been beaten, was displayed open casket so everybody could see it and newspapers could take photographs. And it was displayed in the North, in Chicago, which is where he lived, and he was murdered in the South. So again, you can imagine how big it was across the news. Massively increased support for the civil rights movement in the North and amongst white people again as well. These are all significant reasons. It basically produced masses of publicity for the civil rights movement in favour of African Americans. So there's one of the problems people might get embroiled in when they're trying to think of this question is going through different things that happened rather than the reasons why those things happened. So one thing that made things happen was the actions of civil rights groups. The Greensboro sit-in was actually 4 students just sort of went for it to try to desegregate lunch counters. But hey, it snowballed. More and more people joined in Greensboro. It snowballed to other places around the South where this was happening. And actually, it caused the Greensboro to largely be or at least the lunch counters to be desegregated in North Carolina, spread to other racist southern states, of course. But it also led to the development of the SNCC. It was tied in with it. It was the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee. And they helped those sit-ins to increase and snowball around the South, also was involved in the Freedom Rides and the March on Washington later on. So yeah, the Freedom Rides of course were really significant. We know from the Montgomery bus boycott that buses were no longer allowed to be segregated, in Montgomery anyway, but across the South they were still segregated, so people were getting on long distance bus journeys in the North that went through southern states and sitting all mixed in black and white people. Of course, what did the white people do? Crazy white racist things. I say the white people, lots of the people on the bus of course were white, because there were white supporters of the Civil Rights Movement, but what did the racist crazy white people in the South do? Well, they even tried in Anniston to firebomb the bus and shut everybody on side, hoping that it seemed like trying to kill them all. Luckily they managed to escape. They pulled people off buses and beat them and so on and so forth, until the government stepped in and forced all buses, and not only the buses but the bus stations, all to be desegregated. So this is all because of the actions of certain individual groups taking it upon themselves to sort that out. And I should mention that the people who did organise the Freedom Rides was CORE, which stands for, I believe, the Congress on Racial Equality. Let me just have a little check. Congress of Racial Equality. That's right. So yeah, again, that's another group to organise something which caused change. Of course, very few people could write about the Civil Rights Movement without mentioning Martin Luther King and the impact he had, and he certainly had an impact from 1960 to 62. He'd emerged from the Montgomery bus boycott as a person who could unite the Civil Rights Movement because he could connect with the intellectuals in the NAACP, but he could also connect with the less educated black people in the South, and because he was a pastor, not an Italian food stuff, he was like a vicar, a priest, and so he spoke to the people who were less educated than himself all the time, and he was an incredibly inspirational speaker, to the extent that he probably wrote the most inspirational speech ever. I Have a Dream speech, certainly one of the most famous ever. And he, to give you an example of how he was important, when the Greensboro sit-in people, which was not organised by Martin Luther King, just 4 students took it upon themselves to do something, well, they were attacked, some of them, and they didn't fight back because they were listening to Martin Luther King's teachings of non-violence. The government was influential in setting up the Voter Education Project in 1962, which was to try to help black people get around the restrictions put up against them in different southern states so they could exercise their right to vote. A lot of black people just didn't bother because they knew that if they did, the white people would put up barriers to stop them from voting even higher than they were before. And the result of this was 650,000 new voters registered to vote. Okay, some of those were still refused to vote, the right to vote, on dubious grounds, but again, it was important because it did give some black people a voice, and as soon as they've got the vote, some politicians might start to listen to them. This one was probably a drop in the ocean though, because most black people still couldn't vote, and even those who did try to were often, or sometimes, beaten up and intimidated. So yeah. So again, with this question, people have probably struggled by focusing on events that happened 63 to 65 rather than reasons why. So in this first paragraph I would write about actions of white racists. They led to success of the Civil Rights Movement because it just increased support for the Civil Rights Movement and made the white racists of the South seem ridiculous. So the March on Birmingham, where children were arrested, I believe 2,000 children arrested, people had dogs set on them and high pressure water hose pipes just for a peaceful march. Selma, again, people were beaten and so on and so forth. So the March on Birmingham ended with the March on Washington, which of course helped the Civil Rights Act, and the March on Selma led to the Voting Rights Act, and this is because of the ludicrous actions of white racists, at least in large part, because it gained a lot of publicity and made a lot of people who were neutral or less interested suddenly supporters of the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, you come back to the leadership of Martin Luther King. He was the one who led the march on Birmingham. He was the one who led the march on Selma, and it was he who was front and centre of the march on Washington. All things massively related to the leadership of Martin Luther King. And my final reason will be that the government took more action. So the march on Washington led eventually to the Civil Rights Act. Kennedy met with Martin Luther King, and Kennedy was assassinated, and his vice president, who became President Johnson, passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And then, because it didn't go far enough, the march on Selma, well, the government passed the Voting Rights Act to make sure black people were able to exercise their right to vote. So the fact that the government was taking more action was helping the Civil Rights Movement achieve more. Well, the way I'd help myself stand out in this question is by saying it didn't. But black people did not take more extreme actions in those years. Some people did, but they were the minority. And so most people would just write about why they were taking more extreme methods, whereas the top students might point out, well, only some did, only the minority did. And there's my example. There was 1,000 members of the Black Muslims, 100,000 should I say, 5,000 Black Panthers by 1968, but 250,000 people went to the March on Washington. Now these are small numbers of people in these more extreme civil rights groups. The majority were part of the other groups, which were more inclusive. So I would take issue with the question, and if you've got a solid reason to do so, that is one surefire way to make yourself stand out, because it's an A-level sort of thing to do. The obvious thing here is that they were fed up with not enough change taking place. So yes, the Civil Rights Movement happened, yes, the Voting Rights Act happened, but there were still racists in the South who were preventing fair schooling, like kicking back on segregated schools and trying to do everything they can to keep them segregated, still using intimidation to stop people from voting. Now all of these things were still happening, so they were fed up with not enough change, so they turned to more extreme methods. And you could also say the influence of leaders. Malcolm X, whatever people thought of him, he certainly engaged young African Americans in the Civil Rights Movement. He was leading the Black Muslims, and they were advocating more extreme methods of protest. And Martin Luther King, well, not necessarily because of his own actions, but because he was assassinated in 1968 by a white racist, well, this led to a lot of riots. So the main person advocating a peaceful approach had been killed by 1968, and that might explain why some people switched tactics